Hello, ladies and gentlemen, this is Garbeardia. I am the Beldam, and this is the Emily Braun series Sins of Another, Chapter 5.
Chapter 5. Flesh is Malleable. Dead was an apt name for the particular range of mountains before the big dimensional clash, as they were rust-colored, barren of much vegetation, and the only things that really called them home were big-horned sheep and some kind of rare turtle. Now that there was an overample supply of water in the area, the hills were alive, in a good way. All manner of animals found shelter and solace in the mountains under the boughs and branches of trees, and not all of them were naturally on earth. Many of the trees were fey trees, brought in from home and planted in the wilds to bear strange fruit and mingle with the local population of vegetation. Earth trees took an issue with this, apparently, as it was known that earthen trees would combat the fey trees under the ground, their roots tugging and pulling at each other until one would reign supreme. The earth trees were winning this war, and not fey trees, which had to group together in large groves and defend themselves in numbers against their stronger earthen cousins. It was just one of those things that the other dimensions had come to terms with. Earth creatures didn't fuck around, and the plants followed suit. The temperature felt a little cooler down here, too, probably due to all the fresh water being churned out by the weird machine down to the south that desalinated all the salt water. The trees were tall pines and gnarled-looking desert trees, but also a few blackjack oaks could be seen within the deep forest, and they casted cool shade down onto Emily's motorbike. Morel had wanted to take a quick cat nap after coming down from Palm Gardens, and now lay happily snoozing near the base of a big pine. Emily sat there, watching her as she scrolled through her social media, and chuckled in her throat when she thought back to the morning. Morel had woken on top of Emily's legs, face down in her stomach and drooling down the side of her hip. The centaur had been embarrassed and moaned in horror when Emily took delight in retelling what had happened the night before, partially because it was fun, and partially because she was annoyed that Morel had drooled into her belly button. The two had breakfast down below in the canteen area, and Emily kept using the same seductive tone that she had used the night before with Morel, making sure to eat her breakfast sausage links as awkwardly as possible to make the centaur blush and get flustered. Emily had never seen her eat that fast in the entire time she had known her, and Morel dragged her out of the place as if she were a naughty child that wasn't behaving at a restaurant. On the way out of the dive tail, the same cowboy delivery man was taking an order into the main office, and Emily had seen, going to raise her hand and call out to him. Morel was having none of that, wrapping her thick arm around Emily's rib cage, lifting her right off her feet, and carrying her towards her motorcycle. Emily's fun was cut short, not that she really minded, and the two had set off for the first finger of the Dead Mountains. Morel blew out a long raspberry after an hour nap and stood, rustling herself with a rattle of her saddlebags and their contents. "Geez, girl," Emily said with a laugh and walked over, pulling strands of Morel's black hair out of her mouth as she spluttered at him. When her mouth was clear, Morel smoothed the stray hairs back onto her head. "Sorry, Mama always said I was a messy sleeper." Emily stared up at her, eyebrows raised. "Really? I had no idea. Look, I'm sorry for drooling in your belly button. I get a lot of built-up saliva when I've been drinking," Morel muttered, her face getting hot from the embarrassment. Centaurs don't like being seen as weak, even the Valley Girl variants, and having fallen asleep crying over a delivery guy shooting her down was not a good look from centaur height. Emily fussed over Morel's hair for a few minutes before they kept traveling up the first slope of the mountains, her Zundap actually putting its all-wheel drive to good use for the first time since its purchase. Morel was puffing, the incline doing a bit of stress on her leg muscles, and it was a fair amount of time before they rounded over the top to get a good look on the other side. Emily's voice caught in her throat as she looked out over the huge Clearwater Lake that was once the Mojave Valley, the water stretching far and wide till they bumped against the Black Mesa Range on the other side. Something about the terrain composition and the machine purifying the water had made it into a translucent red color, as if you were seeing the things below its surface through a clear red lens. While the mountains may have lost their dead nature, the unnatural lake made up for it, looking as if someone had slit the throat of a god and let it fill the valley below. Morel was fiddling with her saddlebag for her canteen when she saw Emily looking out over the water, wide-eyed. Yeah, it's pretty cool, but don't go sneaking off for a swim. Not even the nymphs go into those waters. Emily turned to Marill, who was fussing with her canteen cap. Why? It looks normal enough. It's a hot spot for cultists. Plus there's a city down there, Fort Mahav. Around 14,000 people live there. Only a few hundred made it out. It was hit hard, hit fast, and there was something called the Changer that lives down there in the old church building. The nymphs that were paid to scout it out said thousands of cultists slept around it and wait for the orders from whatever the Changer is. Marill finally got her canteen up and chugged from it, a strand of water coming down the side of her mouth and falling down her neck. She puffed out a breath and put the cap back on, continuing on her tale. Anyone they catch alive down there, human anyway, they take alive and drag down to the Changer, and it does something to turn them into whatever the cultists are. There's also some sort of salt water for them there, and I think it turns the water red like this. Emily blinked, then looked out at the water. Huh. The two stood there for a while, looking down into the water and the ever-faint lines of buildings beneath the waves, before they began to move laterally down the top of the mountain ridge they crested, looking around for anything of note. It took a bit, but they ran across something that was stuck in a tree, requiring Marill to throw up a grappling hook in order to shake it out. They were both covered in beads of sweat when the contraption finally fell to the ground, clanging and clanking as it rolled until it came to a stop. To both of their surprise, it was just a normal damn washing machine, and still fully soaked laundry. Emily rooted around inside the drum, pulling out articles of clothing and checking the pockets for anything that would tell them where it came from. The first clue was that it was a Raytag washer, was built in the United Confederation of North America, and ran off a 5-prong electrical cord. The more clothes they pulled out, the weirder it got. Strangler blue jeans, Johnny Hilfinger, Martha's Secret underwear. It was like everything came out of a knock-off secret boutique, except it was well made and well cared for. Judging from the amount of playful things and bras, it was clearly a women's washer. Or at least, Emily figured it was a woman's washer. For all she knew, a dude was wearing this in some other plane of reality to look sexy for his pants-wearing wife. Whoa, Emily, check out this thing! Emily lowered her pair of Chicky's khakis pants and looked over to Marill, who had some kind of novelty underwear in her hands. It was a cute little number with lace, but on the butt cheeks it had the words Mommy's Favorite in bold red letters in a flirty font. Emily began to laugh, but guffawed loudly when Marill spun the panties around, and it was quite clear that these were in fact for a man. Emily and Marill almost spent a full hour rummaging around the sopping wet laundry in this washer, desperately searching for a wallet or a picture, but the only thing they found was a single dollar bill which had a female president on it. In all rights, she was butch, wearing a war-weary scowl and short-cropped haircut, but the pieces of the puzzle were slowly dropping into place on just what kind of alternate plane it was. With a cry of triumph, Marill pulled an extremely wet advert from the pocket of a pair of pants they skipped over, and she held it up in the light. Emily and Marill squished together to try and read it. And on the paper was the most beautiful man they had ever seen. Both of them stood there, admiring the man's fine features, hairless face, alluring eyes, as well as his long hair that came down in ringlets, before either of them spoke. Emily? Yeah? You know of any way to plane travel? Marill, if I ever find a way to, I will take us both to this place, and we can both bag a pretty boy to bring home. Marill gripped Emily's sleeve, and she looked at her, comically serious. If you leave me behind, I'll kill you. They snickered at each other, but Emily did notice that she folded up the piece of paper and tucked it inside her forward saddlebags. The chickies were actually quite nice, too. A nice rugged pair of female pants with actual fucking pockets. Something that made them worth their weight in gold. Emily scooped up an armful of random clothes and tossed them wetly into the trunk of her sidecar. Tootie had bought a bomber jacket from another plane. Maybe she would be into novelty underwear and women's workwear, too. When the stolen washer had provided all the fun and amusement it was capable of, they moved on, ducking and weaving through the trees as they kept open eyes out for anything of value. Gunning her motorcycle through the trees with Marill trotting alongside was beginning to be quite a bit of fun for Emily, as the Zundap was game to dodge and weave as much as she wanted to, and the gearbox was more than able to give her the power she wanted out of her wheels. After an hour of trundling down the side of the mountain, they came across their next find, a bundle of bodies. The flies and insects were buzzing and clicking around them when the two rolled up, and Emily went around to the back of her sidecar's trunk, pulling out a larger bottle of spray designed to keep bugs away. She worked the pump a few times and began to spray, causing the insects that were feasting on the bodies to scatter away, fleeing back into the short grass or the sky. Marill wrinkled her nose as she stepped up, leaning over to look at them in their company patches. "Chippewa Charters. That's Minnesota, isn't it?" Emily nodded, pulling on a pair of thick rubber gloves. She had bought these when she had gotten back from her little airport adventure, just in case she had to pluck a face or an arm from somewhere gooey. The bodies themselves were in pretty bad shape, as the animals and insects were not ones to waste good food when so readily offered. Emily walked over and bent down, grabbing a stick and moving the heads and limbs around, at which Marill began to do the same. From what they could both tell, the group had been hunted and run down until they simply couldn't fight back, stabbed and sliced with bladed weapons until they gave up the goose. As Emily kept poking, she noticed none of them wore holsters or any kind of weapon pouches. "They came out here without guns?" Emily muttered, now walking among the bodies and giving them a better look over. Marill sniffed and used her heavier branch to turn over a male diver near her, rolling him onto his stomach. "It's possible. Not everyone likes to use guns. At the same time, I don't see any scabbards or anything either. A lot of the stab marks seem to be in the back, too." "Fish people do this, then?" Emily asked. "Probably," Marill said flatly, and rolled the dead man back over onto his back. With little else to gain from the bodies and the lack of desire to start hacking off body parts / tossing rotting corpses into their luggage, Emily went around and began collecting their wallets, all of which were thankfully tucked away in pockets. Whatever had killed them, it seemed to have little care or need for the plastic cards or the wallets, which Emily was thankful for. After collecting 6 wallets, Emily had 6 families that would know that their loved ones were finally found, and they began to dig holes to bury them. Emily would have liked to bring them back to the city, but there was no way she could tolerate 6 rotting bodies around her as they continued to work, so a burial was at least in order. When the bodies were tucked away into the earthen worms of the mountainside, Marill pulled out a bundle of break-down sticks from her larger bag, her tail swishing back and forth as she put them together. "What are those?" Marill looked up, ears perked as she continued screwing them together. "GPS marker staves. Lets people know we found bodies, and the staves mark where they are. Just hope those stupid fish heads don't fuck with them." Marill stabbed them into the ground, using her arm muscles and human torso weight to dig them in deep, and placed one at the top of each grave. "There we go. Sleep well, boys. See you on the other side." They both saluted them the diver way, their thumb, pointer, and middle finger held up to their chest over their hearts. Continuing on their path, they spent another hour running up and down the side of the mountain, the ruby-red lake shimmering in the distance the entire time. Emily noticed that some of the trees were missing deeper inside of the tree line, and they both pushed in, working their way past the brush and tree trunks. The closer they got to the spot, the more damaged and scorched the trees looked, as if a meteor had come down and punched into the ground. Once they broke out into the clearing of the main impact area, Emily rolled her Zundep to a stop, her mouth open again in astonishment for the 2nd time in the day. Even Marill was at a loss for words, and she stomped her hoof in disbelief. "I don't believe it," Marill whispered, her hands gripping her uniform top. "A spaceship," Emily breathed out, her eyes running back and forth across the wreckage. The craft itself was not some kind of flying saucer or some cube that cut through the sky, but something that was created by an engineer with an aesthetic in mind. The nose of the craft, or what Emily assumed was the forward body, reminded her of a bird in flight, the nose of it coming down into a blunted point, with a cockpit resting where the eyes would be. On the left side of the cockpit/craft's head was an odd little armor plate, which looked to Emily like a duck wearing a Bluetooth speaker. Buried down into the ground was a mangled-looking cargo bay, the door of which was ripped away and sitting a few yards to the right hardpoint. Emily and Marill made their way over, moving around the large sections of debris that was scattered around, some of it bearing scorch marks or impact marks as if it had been shot at or impacted by some kind of missile. The pylon engines on either side of the craft were huge, as if someone had scaled up a jet engine and then mated it with a grain silo, but they were horribly mangled, only one still being in one piece and still attached to its hardpoint on the side of the craft. The solar panels that were attached fared little better. either shorn off completely and laying on the ground, or shattered to unusability and hanging desperately to the outer wall of the frame. As Emily got closer, the tiny bump she thought was another engine turned out to be a smaller parasite ship that was docked to the larger craft, and she sped around to the other side of the ship, only to find the same bump out was missing, a large hole being the only evidence one ever sat there in the first place. While the front half of the craft had made it out okay, the rear half was almost obliterated, only a small portion of it remaining attached to the main frame while everything else was littering a huge gouge behind it. Going from how deep the gouge was, the pilot had tried to glide the craft in, digging deep in the ground and the rear of the fuselage crumbling apart from the impact and the shuddering that must have come with it. While Muriel skipped around looking for machinery, Emily drove up near the shattered rear of the craft, hopping off of her Zundap and pulling out a large flashlight. The impact had caused the interior to become exposed, and she could see stuff inside that she wanted to have a gander at. She didn't have to climb much to get inside, since the impact had more or less made a little dirt ramp up into the craft, and she was now standing in some kind of compartment way, above her being a few gangways and some doors leading to other rooms. Her boots thudded and echoed on the metal floor, her beam of light shining as she panned it from one side to the other. On the metal ground was a rug, and as Emily bent down to touch it, it seemed really familiar, like something you would have found in an artisan store that rich people shopped in for fun. The table nearby had some letters and ledgers on it, and she leaned over them, spreading the papers out in front of her.
"English," Emily said quietly, running her fingers over the letters that adorned the pages. It spoke of normal things like fuel costs and docking fees, but none of the places sounded familiar to her. She stood up and spied a stairwell, and she took it up to the other level, passing through a few hatchways into a larger room. It seemed the craft still had some power from the panels, as the lights struggled to flicker on when she entered the room. They didn't all work, but it was enough to turn the entire room from dark to dim. Emily casted her beam all over the room, taking in what she saw with the air of a giddy child finding an old bunker, or a secret passage at their grandparents' house. The room was painted in two colors, the lower part a cheery darker yellow, while the upper portion of the walls and ceilings were painted a strange bluish green. In the middle of the room was a wooden table, the legs of which were bolted into the metal floor of the craft. The mix-match chairs were scattered all over the room, some broken, while the others had made it out of the crash mostly intact. As Emily's eyes adjusted, she saw that someone in the crew had just begun painting flowers along some of the surfaces, clearly working their way all the way around to where they had started. It seemed they had quite a ways to go yet, and the thought filled her with a little pinch of melancholy. One of the walls was some kind of locker, and she opened the little doors one by one, peeking inside to peer at whatever lay within. With the food pouches being in English, she was able to read a few and judge that the crew must have been on lean times, as many of the pouches had paste or gel in the name. There was, however, a small box that was in one of the compartments, and when Emily opened it, judged it must have held strawberries at one point, giving it a little sniff to confirm. The room was strange, as while it had many European-style implements, there were just as many Asian ones, such as a large wok that was being held in place by clamps on the wall. Emily was feeling giddy and began to work her way through the entire ship. With a bit of opening and shutting doors, she eventually found the crew quarters and began to learn very quickly about whomever the hell was flying this thing. One must have been some kind of merc, as his room smelled of gun oil and musk, a rather unpleasant smell on all accounts. She didn't stay in there long, as it smelled like a dorm room, and made her way back out, ducking into another room across the way. Here it seemed a couple lived, as the bed was larger and the closets held both male and female clothes. The male must have had an infatuation with floral print Hawaiian shirts, as half of his wardrobe were them and some even in multiples. Emily grabbed a few, tucking them into her assault pack and zipping it tight. She rooted around a bit more, trying to find a picture or something, but the room was a mess due to the crash, and she didn't want to spend too much time in one place. A few of the rooms were locked, and she had to double back around through the ship, finding herself in the huge cargo bay where the door was ripped off of. A lot of the bay was full of earth, having been shoved up into it during the crash, and some kind of skimmer vehicle was buried within the mound of dirt. She saw a door on each side of the gangway and tried one, but the power available only opened it a crack. Sunlight shined through, and Emily reckoned this was where one of the other parasite ships would have been. She quickly jogged to the other side of the gangway, the metal rattling under her boots, and she tried to open that door as well. It parted a few inches, and Emily grabbed a nearby piece of broken rail, using it to wedge open the door until she could slip in. The air inside was scented heavily with incense, and Emily breathed in deep within the darkness. She clicked her flashlight back on and panned it around the interior of the shuttle, whistling softly as she did. Well, someone on this boat was doing well for themselves at least. The room was blood red and crimson from ceiling to floor, adorned with expensive rugs, blankets, cushions, and a curved couch that was against one wall. The crash had done a number in here as well, most of the tables and cabinets being tossed around or broken, and Emily tripped and fell, landing hard on her chest and her flashlight skittering across the large ground rug. The flashlight had slipped past some kind of black veil-like curtains, and she stood, wincing painfully as she did. She parted the curtain slowly with her hand and stepped through, moving a broken hookah out of the way with the toe of her boot. This room was far different, shunting away sex appeal for a cleaner look, and in the middle of the farthest wall was some kind of shrine which her flashlight beam lay upon. Everything else was broken or damaged, but this heavy statue had somehow survived, only being a few inches away from where it originally lay by the impact. She bent down and grabbed her flashlight, moving it over to the statue, and Emily's mouth came into a line. "Hello, Space Buddha." Indeed, the statue was of Buddha, both his hands on his lap and the palm of the top hand up. Emily was unsettled by the statue, despite its calm nature, due to the fact it brought up a lot of questions in her head about just where the fuck this ship had come from. She stepped back through the curtains, and her heel bumped against some kind of box. She turned and put her flashlight on it, and saw it to be very ornate in design. Thinking that finally some kind of payday was going to come of this, she picked up the box and closed the curtains on her friend on the other side of the parasite ship. "Come on, be full of gold coins or some kind of rare material," Emily whispered, and when she opened the case, her eyes widened. She looked up and around the crimson-colored room, and her voice shuddered slightly as she whispered out again, "What kind of fucking ship is this?" She looked back down at the box and set down her flashlight with the beam at an angle where she could still see what she was holding. With her other hand, she pulled out the long glass syringe and held it in her hand, then looked over to the bottle of liquid that sat next to it in its own little cozy hole. Emily felt her mouth go dry. "You never made fancy boxes for medicine or things like that nature. You made boxes like this for when things got hairy, or when you needed an easy out." Emily felt the aura coming from the needle, and she felt it in the back of her mind. Revenge, solace, the final act. Emily did not like how it felt, and she slowly put it back into its fancy box, closing the latch to it. As she went to set it down, she stopped, holding the box in her hand. After a few moments of hesitation, she opened her assault pack and wrapped the box in the Hawaiian shirts, stuffing it down so it was safe before zipping it shut. She didn't like how this room felt anymore, and slipped back through the door, making her way back up the catwalk stairs. She found her way up into the main passageways and followed the signs for the cockpit, quietly stepping up the stairs. Maybe the cockpit would hold some kind of answer for what the hell happened here, and she passed through the open doors into the flight room. Even here there was nothing, no bodies, no logs, and the computers would only flicker for a few seconds at a time, reading out nonsensical strings of letters she didn't understand. The only thing in the room that caught her eye was a single dinosaur toy that was back near the door. Spying it when she had turned around, she leaned down and picked it up, holding it up to the light, and saw that it was a blue stegosaurus, part of it blackened by perhaps smoke. She twisted it slowly in her hand before tossing it over her shoulder, and it squeaked as it bounced off the control deck. The only thing she found besides a few knickknacks and broken teapots was paperwork, and paperwork didn't pay the bills. She searched high and low, even the smelly man room again, but found nothing of interest besides that damn box, and she was starting to get really annoyed. After hours of time searching, she came back out into the light of day and called out to Marill. Marill answered back, and Emily headed towards the rear garbage pile that used to be the rear fuselage. Marill seemed to be having a better time than Emily was, her packs being stuffed full of random bits she had been collecting from the wreckage. When the centaur saw Emily, she trotted over, her packs rattling noisily. "All kinds of cool stuff out here. You find anything?" Emily blanched. Hawaiian shirts, fancy box." Marill looked a bit taken aback, and her eyes flicked from side to side. "Well, that's nice. I found some batteries that may fetch a good price on the market. Even snatched up a few gyroscopes, and anything I've seen before. Plus, the tags are in English. Yeah, the papers I found are covered in English words. No bodies either. The entire thing is a ghost ship. Morrill shrugged. Let's clean up for us. Yeah, I guess. Emily sighed, and as Morrill kept rummaging around, she did the same, kicking over shattered sheets of metal or appearing inside of crates or boxes. It was here she finally found some good luck, and had ripped open an old locker, using a piece of broken framing to wedge the corner open enough so she could slip her arm inside. As she wormed her arm past the bend and felt around with her hands, she felt cold metal, and gripped what felt like a buttstock. Emily's mood shifted almost instantly, and she wiggled the buttstock out. When she held the weapon up and leaned back, she placed it in both hands, and her confusion skyrocketed to further heights. What? A mare's leg? Emily barked and twisted the small rifle around, looking at it from top to bottom. Emily was about to throw in the towel with this craft. What in the hell was something as old in design as a mare's leg doing in a spaceship? Wouldn't space people be using laser guns? As a matter of fact, where the hell were the laser guns? Spaceships were supposed to have laser guns and cool sci-fi doodads, not mystery death syringes and outdated lever actions. Emily worked the action, and despite her mood, was pleased to see it operated smoothly. This still did not help the sourness in her voice when she found Morrill again, and held the weapon out with her hand. Look at this shit! We came all this way to a spaceship to find something from the Wild West! Morrill smiled cheekily and leaned back, pulling something from her saddlebags. Well, do I have good news for you? Really? A holster belt? What am I, an extra in a space spaghetti western? Morrill held up the leather gun belt and wiggled it back and forth. Come on, look, it even still has bullets in it. Emily rolled her eyes and took the belt, tucking it under her arm. Super. Centaur gets space batteries, and the human gets half of a cowboy costume. Emily stopped mid-step and spun around on her single heel. Hey, you're not trying to use me as some kind of fill-in for the delivery boy, are you? Emily screeched and broke into a run as Morrill began heaving bits of blackened machinery at her, the heavy things thunking down into the ground like inert bombs. Oh, you think that's funny, do you? Come here and I'll buckle that thing around your neck! Congratulations! You made it to the end of the video. Did you get the reference? Comment down below to see if you're correct. If you enjoyed the video, hit the little like button to let us know. And if you want to see more content from us, hit subscribe. And make sure to hit the little bell icon so that way you'll actually know when we send out a new video. I am the Beldam, and this has been Guardbeardia.